I want to start with the usual caveat. The Congressional Research Service, as you know, does not advocate policy. We have to serve all members equally on every side of the issue. So what I will say will try to be as neutral as possible. But I'll try to hit some of the highlights of congressional interest in the issue of enrichment and reprocessing regarding peaceful nuclear cooperation agreements up to the present day, as much as I can do in a very short time. So it's going to be very, very high level, and hopefully if there are questions we can deal with them. So I'm going to jump ahead to the post 9/11 terrorist period, which was a period of heightened interest in weapons of mass destruction and proliferation, and it led to some policies from the George W. Bush administration that helped set the scene for what we've seen recently. In that time period, in the post 9/11 attacks, of course, there was rising concern about nuclear programs in where else, Iran and North Korea. And a lot of this led to a White House statement by President Bush to the National Defense University in February 11, 2004. And the area that we're interested in regarding enrichment and reprocessing was where the administration and President Bush specifically referred to the Nonproliferation Treaty loophole, using that exact word, which they saw as really a flaw in the treaty and a flaw in our non-proliferation regimes, in which enrichment and reprocessing for weapons, they believed, can be conducted, quote, under the cover of civilian nuclear programs. And their belief that international safeguards were not enough, and that this perceived right to conduct enrichment and reprocessing was a huge problem that they had seen lead to proliferation. So the Bush administration, in this same, to implement that, then in 2007, the Bush administration, in its budget request, introduced what was known as the Global Nuclear Energy Partnership. And this gets back to exactly what was tried to be done in the 78 Act to try to create incentives against enrichment and reprocessing. So the GNEP program generated great congressional interest over the years, since it did, of course, involve a lot of appropriations. The basic idea was that countries, the United States would lead a group of countries, anybody interested in nuclear power and involved in nuclear power, to create a system in which nuclear fuel would be supplied to recipient nations in return for their agreeing to forego enrichment and reprocessing. So this had a lot of implications for the United States, one of which was the implication that the United States was, of course, going to be a supplier nation and actually take back spent fuel and potentially put it in a U.S. repository. That was proved to be a very controversial idea. The program eventually was criticized for when it started to try to move ahead into implementation and actually build reprocessing facilities in the United States, which of course is expensive and controversial. Eventually was put aside, but the program still exists under IFNEC, the International Framework for Nuclear Energy Cooperation, and is still, it's not as explicit about the supplier and recipient nations. It's more, sold as countries getting together to try to do proliferation-resistant nuclear programs. Another element of the 2004 statement was that the Nuclear Suppliers Group should refuse to sell enrichment and reprocessing equipment to countries without full-scale plants already in operation. That led to some changes, additional criteria in the Nuclear Suppliers Group, but not an outright ban. The Bush administration then took this philosophy and moved forward with various memorandums of understanding with some countries to try to get them to forego enrichment and reprocessing. One of these was the United Arab Emirates, UAE, around 2007, 2008, I'm not sure it's the exact date. But this led into the Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, the 123 Agreement, with the UAE that the Bush administration signed in January 2009, immediately before leaving office. And this relied on the Memorandum of Understanding to handle the enrichment and reprocessing issue, but they did not submit it to Congress and left that to the Obama administration because there were obviously a lot of congressional concerns, mostly at the time dealing with UAE history, dealing with Iran and other issues. UAE was very controversial at the time. They had just had the Dubai Ports World controversy where the company in UAE had a contract to take over the operation of U.S. ports, which Congress had an extreme negative reaction to. So in that context, the UAE actually was somewhat amenable to going farther because they realized that their political standing was not great. So under the Obama administration, they did change the agreement to include explicit and legally binding commitments not to enrich or reprocess within their territory, which became famously known as the gold standard, which as far as we know has only been officially used in one time, but it really caught on. And when looking back at it, it's obvious that they were trying to sell this as like, look, this agreement has this gold standard, it's really tremendous. Because if you look back at the statements of reaction to Congress, it was pretty negative. What we see now is this very high watermark for nonproliferation, actually, because it was the UAE, everybody focused on Iran and how can we do business with UAE, and the so-called gold standard did not really make a big impact at the time. But nevertheless, that did lead to a lot of interest in Congress, and in fact, it was eventually perceived as an important achievement that, in fact, perhaps should apply more broadly. But the administration subsequently indicated that the gold standard, so-called, which they didn't call it anymore, was actually really meant just for the Middle East mostly. And then eventually, as more and more 123 agreements began to be, in front of them, and their individual cases, with each one, then it was sort of, well, it's really a case-by-case basis because applying the general principle to individual countries proved to be, to involve many, many conflicting goals. So it's case-by-case, somewhat controversial in Congress, leading to what we've just talked about from the Congresswoman Ross Latainen and other members who introduced H.R. 1280 in the 112th Congress shortly after this time to do what she talked about, to change the approval process for 123 agreements to require a positive approval by Congress for any agreement that did not include an agreement such as the so-called gold standard to forego enrichment and reprocessing. This involved a lot of hearings, actual full committee approval. March 17, 2011, the language was adopted in a substitute amendment 34-0, and it was reported by voice vote at that time, showing there was quite a bit of support in the committee at that time for that. And that bill has been reintroduced, as was mentioned, in subsequent Congresses. The issue has come up in a lot of 123 agreements that have been considered. It's almost always now brought up. Should there be a gold standard? Should there not be a gold standard? Especially like Vietnam, Norway. Now we have the Saudi Arabia agreement, which we had the hearings that we talked about, which the gold standard issue was very prominent, and that brings us to this very day. Did I make it?
Yeah. Now, someone in the back nibbled at my ear, so I'll share with you.
Hello.
Two countries. Of course, we can't say it's a country. Taiwan. So it's UAE and Taiwan. But maybe technically, since some people don't want to consider Taiwan a country, you can get away with it.
And Vietnam has sort of like the first UAE agreement, a side letter.
Yeah.
So.
Taiwan has a phase-out policy.
What's that?
Phasing out nuclear.
Yes. Well, that's the ultimate solution.